Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about Exploration 2 and Exploration 3 from our book, Lesson 2. If you're using your book, you're using the PDF document, I'm on page 25 right now, 25. We're going to talk about cell models today, using cell models, the different types of cell models, as well as the size of cells, and why cells are limited in the size they can be. So today we're going to talk about 3D models, we're going to talk about 2D models, and we're also going to talk about analogies of cells. And we're going to compare the different organelles, structures of cells, to things that may be a little more familiar to us. And so if we look at the analogy, the border between countries, what part of the cell, what structure of the cell represents the border between countries? And that's the cell membrane. The cell membrane controls what comes into the cell, it controls what goes out of the cell, just like the border between countries. They control what comes into the cell, or what comes into the country and what goes out of the country. And so if you've ever crossed a border into another country, for example like the United States and Canada, there's people that work that border, and they check things out, and they allow certain things to come in. They may prevent things from coming into a country. They may prevent things from leaving a country. And so that's much like the cell membrane. The cell membrane checks things before it brings them in. It checks things before it lets it out. So it only allows things to come in that should come in and things to go out that should go out. Okay. If we look at the analogy, the control center, what part of the cell is the control center? And that's the nucleus. The nucleus of the cell is the control center. So the nucleus controls what all the other organelles do. It controls what things the cell produces. And so the nucleus controls every other part of the cell. The genetic material that's in the nucleus control that. And so that is the control center of the cell. In this kind of dark circle here, that's the nucleus in this cell. If we look at cells, the analogy, what is the power plant of the cell? Well, that's the mitochondria. The mitochondria are the power plant of the cell. The mitochondria generate energy for the cell. So they take the sugars that a cell brings in and converts it into energy the cell can use. So like you, when you eat food, your intestines then break that food down, and it gets those sugars out of those foods that you eat. And those sugars are then transported to the cells, and then the cells, the cell membrane, recognizes those sugars and brings them into the cell where they go to the mitochondria. And then those sugars are transformed into a form of energy that the cell can use. That's like the power plant. If we look at the analogy, what is the solar panel of the cell? Well, the solar panel is the chloroplasts. The chloroplasts gather the light energy from the sun, and they convert that light energy and carbon dioxide and water, and they convert that into sugars that the cell can use. And so then those sugars that the chloroplasts produce then go to the mitochondria, where they are then converted into a form of energy the cell can use. And so what is the solar panel? That's the chloroplast of the cell. If we flip the page, we're actually going to skip page 26 and 27 right now. So flip to page 28, and we're going to look at the differences between a 3D model of a cell, the 2D model, and some of the advantages and disadvantages of those. So if you look at the 3D model of the cell, some of the advantages are you can see where the organelles are in the 3D space better. You can see the shape of those organelles. From this, we can see that the nucleus, this dark purple ball-looking thing, is a ball shape. It's not just flat. It's kind of like a ball. But it's a little bit harder to see all the organelles at once in the 3D model. You can't see all the organelles at once quite as easily. If we look at the 2D model, we can see all the organelles at once. We can see the relative size of those organelles better. But it's a little bit harder to see what the actual shape of those organelles are. For example, we can't see the nucleus here, this purple oval here, with this dark circle in the middle. That dark circle is called the nucleolus. We'll talk about it later. But we can see that it's there. It's a pretty big organelle, but it's kind of hard to tell what kind of shape it actually is. Same for the mitochondria here. These are mitochondria, little yellow structures. We can kind of see in there, they just kind of look flat. But we can't see the actual shape. They actually look very much like a bacterial cell does. That's actually what they look very much like a bacterial cell does. So they both have some advantages and disadvantages. If we look at our evidence notebook here, question number 10 at the bottom of the page, the evidence notebook, it always refers back to the beginning of the lesson. So whatever's at the beginning of the lesson, so in this case we're talking about a sports stadium, we're comparing it to a cell, that's what that evidence notebook is always referring to. So if we look back here, we're thinking about that sports stadium and the cell. We're thinking about the model we're developing that compares a sports stadium to a cell. What happens to the cell parts and how do they interact? Well, all parts of the cell contribute to the function as a whole, just like a sports stadium. All parts of that sports stadium are essential for that sports stadium to function. So all parts of a cell, all organelles of a cell are essential for that cell to function. Kind of like the organs in your body, your heart, your lungs, liver, kidneys, all of those organs, they have a particular role, a specific role that they fulfill. And without one of those organs, the whole organism wouldn't be able to survive. Just like for a cell, if we were missing one organelle, that those organelles play a vital role, and so without those organelles, the cell itself couldn't survive. So if we look at the Exploration 3, we're going to talk about the limits of cell size and why cells are limited to a certain size. The average human has around 37 trillion cells. The bigger the human is, the more cells they're going to have, though. So cells themselves are relatively the same size between organisms. So a muscle cell in a mouse is relatively the same size as a muscle cell in a human. But the cells themselves, the different types of cells, can vary a little bit. So a muscle cell and a blood cell, those cells types may vary a little bit, but the size are relatively the same. And so if we were comparing a human and a mouse, humans must have more cells than mice. They can't just have bigger cells because the cell size is limited, actually, and the cells are relatively the same size, and so humans must have more cells than mice. So why is that? So if we're given our answer to explain the reasoning, humans and mice, the cells are relatively the same size, but a human is made of more cells than a mouse is. So if we were comparing humans to like a blue whale is much bigger than a human, so a blue whale is going to have many, many more cells than what a human has. So a blue whale is just made of many, many, many more cells. And there's a reason behind that. There's a relationship between surface area and volume. Cells want to have a lot of surface area and a small volume, and the reason is because of the exchange of nutrients and waste. And we're going to talk about that here on the next page. So if we look at our evidence notebook again, we're comparing that cell to a sports stadium. Organelles in the entire cell system depend on the cell membrane to get waste out and nutrients in. A sports stadium isn't really dependent on getting the waste out and nutrients in quite as much as a cell is, and so there's a little bit difference in that analogy. Okay, if a cell can't get the waste out and the nutrients in fast enough, the cell will die. Okay, so the bigger a cell is, the further the cell membrane, the outside of the cell, is to the center of the cell. And so what would happen is waste would build up in the middle of that cell, and they couldn't get out of the cell fast enough. And when those wastes would to build up in the cell, it would actually kind of like poison the cell from the inside, and the cell would die. It also wouldn't be able to get the nutrients in fast enough, so it couldn't get energy and things that it needs for it to function fast enough for those cells. And so what problems would result if a cell gets too large? Waste would not be able to leave the cell quick enough. Nutrients would not be able to reach all parts of the cell quickly. Okay? So if we were citing evidence from our text, maybe some calculations, explain why cells are unable to perform important functions as they get too large. Well, the larger a cell gets, the more volume it has. And as the volume increases faster than the surface area, that when a cell gets bigger, it basically becomes less efficient for moving nutrients in and waste out. It has to be very efficient in moving those nutrients in and waste out. Without that, the cell couldn't survive. And so if we were designing a building, say we were designing a building that must minimize energy transfer in the form of heat loss, describe the building shape that would minimize heat loss through the surface of the building. And we want to explain our reasoning there. And so basically, if we wanted to minimize heat loss, we don't want to allow heat to get to the outside. And so we want a shape that's basically opposite of what a cell wants. We want a building that's very large, a very large building. And that way it's a long ways from like the center of that building to the outside. And so the heat kind of becomes trapped inside of that building. If the heat becomes trapped, it can't get to the outside very easily. If you had a building that was really long and skinny, no place in that building would be very far to the outside. And so then heat could go in and out of that building quite easily. But if you had a big kind of cube-shaped building, then there'd be a large distance from the inside of that building, one of the interior rooms of that building, to the outside. And so it becomes harder for that heat to escape to the outside. So basically, if we wanted to minimize energy transfer, we want what the opposite is of a cell. All right, guys, so that's the end of lesson 3. That's the end of this unit, actually, as far as the lecture goes. So make sure if you have any questions over this, you're contacting your teacher to get those questions answered. All right, guys, thanks for all your hard work.